Good morning. My name is Marco Carnovale, and I will make today a presentation on the history of NATO during the Cold War. This is part of a two-presentation set. The second part will be about NATO after the Cold War. This is NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. We'll see what that means in a while. OTAN is the French, because the French is also an official language in NATO. It's not used very much, but it is still an official language in NATO. So we can start in 1945, end of World War II. The United States and allied armies are coming in from the west. The Russian Soviet army is coming in from the east. The Germans are in the middle. Germany is defeated, and Europe is in rubble. So you can see here a typical picture of what a German town looked like at the end of World War II. But a typical, in this case, Scottish town on the side of the winners really didn't look that much better. In this situation, we had the Americans and the Soviets, Western allies, Americans, British, French, and Polish, and the Soviets, who were friends, were allies. They had fought together. On the left, you can see here a poster from the wartime advertising the Russians, Soviets, as friends fighting for freedom. Never mind, they were really ruled by Stalin, who wasn't exactly a freedom lover at the time, but the narrative during the World War II was that the Soviets were our friends. That, of course, changed quite quickly when relations turned sour at the end of World War II, and the Soviet army now becomes a threat. The Red Army becomes a threat. This Soviet poster says, "We demand peace, but if you touch us." Well, they did touch actually a lot of countries. Eastern Europe was occupied by the Soviet armies against its will. Soviet system was imposed on them, and the West felt very vulnerable. This is the first reason that brought about the creation of NATO. The second reason is that the Americans wanted to go home. The Americans entered the war not wholly enthusiastically. If you remember, they set out the first 2 years, and then only after Pearl Harbor, the United States intervened in the war in Europe as well. But at the end of the war, American soldiers wanted to go home. This photo shows a troop ship taking GIs back to the United States. And the third reason why NATO was founded is the fear of German revanchism. You see this little flag here. It's about something, the Western Union. It was founded in 1948. You wouldn't have heard of it. I never heard of it, even though I worked on these issues most of my life. It was an alliance between the British, the French, and the Benelux countries to guard against German revanchism. That didn't look very credible from the start, and therefore the NATO, North Atlantic Alliance, was founded, bringing together Western Europeans and North Americans, US and Canada. Somebody who recapped the reasons I just mentioned very well was General Lord Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, who said we need to keep the Russians out of Western Europe. We need to keep the Americans in, because the Americans wanted to go home, and we need to keep the Germans down to make sure that the war that was fought against the Kaiser and then against Hitler would not happen again. Very typical British humor, if you want, but I think he captured very well what the situation was, and he was made the first Secretary General, the leader of this new alliance. This is what NATO looked like, the blue countries on the left here on the western side of this map. Algeria is not blue, but it should be, because the French considered Algeria as part of metropolitan France, and therefore it was also part of the NATO territory that would be collectively defended in case of attack. And on the right, you can see the red countries, that's the Soviet Union, and the occupied countries that were facing the Europe, and that was creating so much fear. An attack against one is an attack against all. That's the Article 5 commitment in the treaty. So it's a legally binding law, a treaty ratified by the member states of all countries. So NATO is a North Atlantic Treaty, and then O is for organization. It actually was considered necessary at the time to put together an organization with a headquarters that initially was based in London, in this place, building in Belgrave Square, to run the affairs of the alliance. And that's where the first Secretary General, Lord Ismay, was based. After a while, they decided to move it to France, to Paris, because it was symbolically considered important to have NATO on the continent of Europe, as opposed to on an island in the United Kingdom. So what is NATO? It is a country, it is an organization of sovereign countries. NATO doesn't have any independent power to act the way, for example, the European Union does. It is only a collection of sovereign states. The Leviathan sovereign of Hobbes here is a symbol of that. And that's why the organization is headed by a Secretary General and not by a president, for example. Conventionally, because America is so much bigger than everybody else in NATO, it was considered politically correct, if you want, to have a European heading NATO. Here I have 3 of the Secretaries General that succeeded one after the other in running this organization. Willy Klaas, the Belgian, he's known for being the only Secretary General to actually resign in office because of a scandal. And Manfred Werner, very important, he is remembered because he was the first German, and so far the only German, who was appointed to run NATO. Remember, NATO was born in part to prevent the future threat of a new, strong Germany against Western Europe. Well, now you have a German actually heading the organization. And the one on the right, it is the longest serving Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg from Norway. As of now, in January 2024, he is the leader of the alliance still now. On the other hand, you had also the military component of NATO. The Secretary General runs the infrastructure of the political, the civilian establishment, but the military side is in a different structure, and that is run by an American general. Obviously so, because the American armed forces are so much more powerful than all the others in NATO, that SACEUR, Supreme Allied Commander Europe, is always a US general. The first one was General Eisenhower, the victor of World War II, who was appointed by the member states to run the NATO military structure. Another famous one was Alexander Haig. You will remember he then became more famous for what he did later when he became a Secretary of State, as well as having been the NATO leader. But the military side of NATO is still a collection of national forces. There is no such thing as a NATO army. There is national forces that you see in these photos that are chopped, they say, chopped in wartime, meaning detached from their national command into an integrated military structure. There is an exception to this rule, and it is the AWACS planes. The AWACS planes are collectively owned by NATO. They are, the AWACS stands for Airborne Warning and Control Systems, and they are based in Central Europe, and they're used to detect incoming hostile movements, aircraft or land movements from the air. But other than that, NATO, again, is a collection of sovereign states that are bound by a treaty. Attack against one is an attack against all, but retain their independence and their sovereignty over their armed forces until they choose to do otherwise. Well, NATO, as I mentioned earlier in the first photo, was a collection of only 12 countries in the beginning, but very soon it became an attractive proposition for a number of other countries in Europe. And in 1952, Greece and Turkey became the first two new members of NATO. They were brought in at the same time, among other reasons, because people thought, well, if Greece and Turkey don't always have a very friendly relations, if that should escalate into a conflict, it could weaken the Western alliance against the Soviet Union. So we'll bring them in together, and this will hopefully also facilitate an improvement in relations between them. And it did. Greek and Turkish officials, as well as military leaders working side by side over the decades, helped to improve the relations between these two countries. However, there was only one case in which there actually was a war between member states. I say this with half a smile because this is between something that happened between Iceland, a member state of NATO that has no armed forces, and the United Kingdom, which of course is got one of the biggest armed forces after the US, nuclear power. But during the Cold War, they actually fought some Cod wars in the 50s and up until the 70s. This is, by the way, the only ship in the Icelandic Coast Guard that is what they have in terms of armed forces. That's it. But they actually fought when the British fishermen were coming too close for comfort for the Icelanders. And this is a clash that happened. And I think one person died as well. And so in the end, there was a compromise, and the fishermen continued to fish, but at a lower rate. But anyway, it is not a huge issue, although it was for the Icelanders. But it shows how even among allies, when vital interests come to the fore, there was a danger of conflict. But by and large, the membership of NATO made all of the member states' relations among each other much more friendly. In 1955, the big step forward in NATO's expansion or enlargement, as some people call it, as NATO calls it, was when West Germany, that is to say, the western sectors of occupied Germany, the ones under the control of the UK, France, and the US, joined as the Federal Republic of Germany as a new member of NATO. This is only 10 years after the end of World War II. And you can imagine, didn't go down very well with the Soviet leadership back in Moscow to see Germany, the enemy, the one that we had defeated together with the Americans, now joining NATO. And the response to that was the creation of the Warsaw Pact, a similar treaty signed in Warsaw in 1955 that brought together the countries that had been under Soviet, I would say, clearly occupation, and upon which the Soviet system, the socialism, had been imposed. So it wasn't really the same thing as NATO in the East, because NATO had been joined voluntarily by the member states, and that was not the case of the members of the Warsaw Pact. The proof of that is that next year, the following year, in 1956, Hungary revolted. It wanted to join NATO, leave the Warsaw Pact, chuck the socialist system and join NATO. But the Soviet invaded, and that was not possible. NATO did not come in to help. Why didn't come in to help? Obviously, there was a general reluctance to start another war in Europe, but more specifically, by this time, both sides had nuclear weapons. And here I want to introduce the nuclear dimension in the equation. People fear that an intervention by NATO to save Hungary and accept Hungary into NATO would provoke a war with the Soviet Union that could escalate to a nuclear war. So people made fun of NATO. They said NATO is powerless. It cannot really do anything because the Soviet Union is so powerful. But then again, this is the reason is that you had this balance of power of nuclear weapons that was very difficult, made it very difficult to envisage a conflict. This is where the nuclear weapons I'm talking about are based in Western Europe. And these are all American weapons, all American-owned nuclear weapons, but in most of these cases, they are carried by Allied aircraft. So you would have a German, Dutch, Belgian, whatever, pilot on a plane owned by these countries carrying in its bomb bay a American nuclear bomb for possible mission against hostile forces. This was good enough for the countries that you see in this map, but not for some other countries. For example, the United Kingdom, member of NATO and of course close ally of the US, nonetheless, it wanted to have its own nuclear forces, and they developed a number of different forces. I will talk about it in a different presentation, but suffice it to say, the mainstay is the submarine launched nuclear forces. Here you see on the left the Trident trigger, which is not a tongue twister, but it is the button that would release British nuclear missiles launched from submarines like this HMS Victorious against an enemy should the Prime Minister of Britain so order. The other country that developed nuclear weapons was France. Now, while the British developed it in close cooperation technologically and otherwise with the Americans, France developed its own nuclear weapons totally independently. The reason why is because the Americans wouldn't help them, nor would the British. And so, therefore, after the humiliation in Indochina and in Suez, France decided it had to develop its own nuclear weapons to preserve, in their view, their great power status in the world. And in 1960, France detonated a nuclear weapon for the first time in Algeria, of course. That was part of France, but safely away from Paris and Nice and Marseille. And the French Air Force, the Army, as well as the Navy, were all endowed over time with nuclear weapons. That means the French now had their own force, and they were not happy for having been sidelined by the Americans and the British. So in 1966, de Gaulle wrote a letter to the Secretary General and kicked NATO out of France. Remember this nice building in central Paris? Now they had to go. On the right here, you see one of the French independent nuclear capability missiles. So very quickly, NATO had to find new headquarters, and Belgium offered to host NATO the same way it was going to host the European Union. And in only 200 days, what was supposed to be a temporary headquarters was built in Brussels. Looked something like this. This is where I worked in the 90s and early 2000. And this is where then Secretary General and all the staff were hosted temporarily, they said, but actually they ended up staying there 50 years. And only after 50 years in 2017, they moved to a definitive headquarters. Going back to the nuclear weapons that caused so much friction among the Allies, I mentioned some of the NATO bombs are American, but the aircraft that carry them are European. And the way this is arranged is something called the dual key arrangement. Here you see in the red circle some of the original dual key. I mean, there are really two keys needed to unlock the codes to make sure that the bombs would go off. Then the two keys became electronic, and the system called PAL, permissive action links, was developed so that instead of two actual keys, you would have electronic codes. But you get the idea. The point was that two countries would have to, represented by two officers, of course, in the field, would have to agree. The Americans as owners of the bomb and the Europeans as owners of the aircraft. Some of these weapons were placed on what was called the quick reaction alert. During the Cold War, there was a lot of this. It was later reduced. I don't know, it's classified now, but I would guess it's probably been used again now. What this means is that you have the American bomb and the European aircraft placed ready to go on the tarmac and ready to take off and against a target in as little as 15 minutes. Sometimes the pilots were all suited up and actually set in the cockpit ready to fly. Sometimes they were in a small house nearby. But the point is, you can see this man running. NATO was ready to mobilize and deploy these weapons very quickly indeed. And they were, of course, deployed on a number of occasions, for example, to intercept incoming Soviet aircraft that were too close for comfort to NATO airspace, and for exercises. So this was never, of course, used in practice. We never had to drop a bomb on anybody, but the practice was there and the readiness was there over many decades. At some point, people thought, let's have a NATO nuclear force. And they actually equipped an American ship, the USS Ricketts, with nuclear bombs. And the crew was then chosen from a number of different countries whose flags you can see here: UK, Germany, Italy, Greece, Denmark, and the US, of course. That proved to be very complicated. It didn't really work out, and the effort was abandoned after a few years. And this is where we are today. Well, not quite today. This is 2019. It's the latest data that was came out in public. The real numbers are classified, but I can tell you that these numbers, in my view, are probably very close to reality. Of course, I've been away from NATO for a long time, so the numbers I know and that I'm not allowed to share are obsolete secrets anyway, but these numbers are roughly, I think, a good picture of the reality. You're talking about 150 nuclear weapons or so. Very small number compared to the thousands that were deployed in Europe over the decades at the height of the Cold War. I have spoken about secrets, and NATO, of course, has a lot of secrets, and there is procedures and all kinds of systems in place to protect these secrets. People who have access to them, when they have access, for how long they have access, and so on and so forth. And yet, there was a major breach of secrecy in NATO that I want to talk to you about now. And that is the story of topaz and turquoise. And these are not jewels like the ones you can find in the shop of this ship, but they are two spies that worked in NATO. A German, Rainer Rupp, who worked in the political affairs division, economic departments. That's where I worked myself, actually, a bit later. And his wife, Anne-Christine Bowen, who is British and worked in no less in the Office of Security, the office that is charged with keeping the secrets in NATO. Their code names were Turquoise, Topaz, and Turquoise, and they worked for the East German secret police and the KGB. They gave tons, literally tons of documents to them during the course of the late 70s and the 80s. They said they did it to make sure that the Soviet Union knew that NATO was not aggressive. They said they did it for peace. They said if we share all our documents with them, they will know we're not planning for war. Of course, it is true we were not planning for war, but they gave a lot of other things to the Soviet Union that could have helped them, the Soviets, plan their war against NATO. So also, some people really didn't think that their motives, their alleged motives, were credible. They also were paid for this, but they got away with very light sentences, and they're free now. And this brings up a question, though, that is more important than either of them. So NATO had all this information from the headquarters, at that time photocopied and passed on, or microfilmed and passed on to the Stasi, the Staatssicherheit, the Secret Service of East Germany, and the KGB of the Soviet Union, and yet they lost the Cold War. They knew everything about NATO, nearly everything about NATO, and they still lost. What does that mean? That they were dumb? I don't think so. The KGB and the Stasi, they had quite capable people working for them. What it means is that really the big secrets of the West were not in NATO. We now know that the most sensitive information is shared by 5 countries that compose what is referred to as the Five Eyes, and the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and Canada. And that's where the most sensitive information is shared. It is not shared within NATO. I didn't know that at the time. Oh, nobody knew that, that I know when I was working in NATO. We learned that later when this guy, a gentleman by the name of Edward Snowden, spilled the beans, and he revealed the existence of the Five Eyes only in the 2000. The fact that he did it so, of course, put him on the wanted list in the United States, and he had to flee, and he is now living happily, guess what, in Russia, in Moscow. He even became a Russian citizen, and some people consider him a villain because he betrayed his country. He committed treason, really, revealing very sensitive information. Other people considered him a hero because in a lot of the documents that he spilled and revealed, actions became known that were not known before, actions by the United States government and some of their allies that violated American law and the laws of NATO countries. So one point of view has it that he actually performed a service to NATO by exposing people that were breaking the law. You can make up your own mind as how you think about this, but this brings us to the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union's collapsed despite having the NATO secrets and East Germany, of course, is no more. In 1987, the reason why East Germany is no more is in 1987, Reagan started the process, if you want, when he famously appealed to Gorbachev, the Soviet leader, to take the wall down, the Berlin Wall, of course, that had divided Berlin the same way that all of Germany had been divided. Gorbachev obliged, and when the East Germans started to build up the pressure for unification, Gorbachev ordered the forces of Soviet Union and East Germany not to open fire like they had done before. Hundreds of people died trying to cross the Berlin Wall. No more so in 1989, 9th of November, the wall comes down and it's celebrated worldwide. This is Mstislav Rostropovich going to play at the Berlin Wall, and Reagan and Gorbachev, the two protagonists of the war, coming in 1992, both out of office to commemorate the event in Berlin. So we are now in a situation where what do we do with all these tanks and aircraft and bombs and soldiers that we have mobilized over decades? There is no more enemy. The East-West division is gone. And so NATO and the Warsaw Pact developed a treaty on conventional forces, establishing these limits that you see, so that both NATO and the Warsaw Pact would be allowed to have no more than 13,000 troops, 300 tanks, and 500 armored combat vehicles, 250 pieces of artillery. Well, the funny thing about this very nice arms control treaty is that the moment it came into existence, the member countries that had signed, signatories of this treaty, disappeared. The Soviet Union, as we know, disappeared, and the Warsaw Pact itself was considered, was dissolved, and therefore people started to ask, is NATO still necessary? This is a map of NATO, a real map used by NATO for planning purposes that was declassified at the end of the Cold War. And you can see here now all these numbers all of a sudden don't make any sense anymore. And so here we are, 1989, Berlin Wall is down, 1990, the Warsaw Pact is dissolved, 1991, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. Do we still need NATO? Is it something that still makes sense? And if so, does it have to change? And this is going to be the subject of my next presentation that will focus on the life of NATO after the Cold War. Thank you for your attention, and see you at the next presentation.